how do you all see the sea? Is the sea something that draws you? You see it as a place of beauty and rest, as long as your feet are safely on the shore?
It's untamed.
It's untamed. So how does the idea of actually being out there on the sea, what about that idea? Does that make you feel uneasy knowing that it's untamed, that it's this wild thing that can do with you and your boat whatever it will? By and large, ancient Israel was a group of landlubbers, and so they were not at all comfortable with the idea of the sea. For them, when they wanted to have an image of a place that was full of chaos, maybe even unknown monsters, and potential destruction, they would use metaphors about the sea. But Israel, as the people of God, also knew that those vast, untamed waters were no problem for their God. God could tame those waters, could control them. The waters trembled at the presence of God instead. Psalm 77 starts off with the psalmist in trouble, and he's calling out to God. And one of the things that he says to himself as he's in this situation, needing God, calling out to God. Verse 11, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. And one of these things that he thinks of is God conquering the sea. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and were afraid. The very depths quaked. The clouds poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Verse 19, your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. And it's clear as the psalm goes on that the psalmist is thinking about what God did to the Red Sea as Moses led Israel out of Egypt. And this, just glorying in God's power over the mighty waters, is a repeated theme in the Psalms. Psalm 65 praises the God who formed the mountains by his power and stilled the roaring of the seas and the roaring of their waves. Psalm 89 verse 9, you rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. Psalm 93 verse 4 exalts, mightier than the thunder of the great waters, mightier than the breakers of the sea, the Lord on high is mighty. And I could give you more examples from the Psalms too. Well, in our text, Matthew 14, Jesus too showed power over the raging sea, over this place of chaos. The story starts, our text, at the end of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Jesus and his disciples had gone by boat to a remote place on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. They had hoped to be alone, hoped to find some rest, but a huge crowd followed them. They followed them along the shore. I guess they could keep sight of the ship, knew which way the ship was going. They were probably following like 10 miles or so along the shore, and they were there, met them when the boat landed. Well, the hope had been for some R&R, some time away from the crowds, but Jesus had compassion on them. He taught them. He healed their sick. As evening approached, the people had been there all day. They were hungry. There was going to be a long walk back along the shore before they reached home and food. So Jesus told the disciples to feed them. In verse 17, the disciples said, "We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes." Verse 19, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples, and his disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And 5,000 men, and there were women and children as well. Immediately after that, our text this morning starts. Verse 22. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. Sort of a interesting note here that Jesus cares enough about the crowd that he doesn't just, simply disappear, make himself scarce, but he takes the time to send them off before he takes his leave. Verse 23, after he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. So the crowd was gone, dismissed. The disciples were in the boat, heading back across the sea, like about 8 miles maybe to the home shore. But Jesus goes up on a mountainside to pray. Throughout the Gospels, there are many times that it mentions Jesus spent time alone in prayer, sometimes late at night, sometimes very early in the morning. Now, what happens next is sort of, one commentator called it a tableau of the Christian life, a tableau where you make this scene that sort of represents something. The next verses sort of represent what our Christian life is like so many times. What it's like as we follow Jesus. Verse 24, in the middle of the night, the boat is still a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So they had, maybe 8 miles to their home shore. And because there was a strong wind against them, they couldn't put up the sail and have the free energy getting them there, but they had to row. They were rowing, but they weren't getting too far. They were still a considerable distance from both shores, I guess. The waves were tossing them. And they were there because they were following Jesus. Verse 22, Jesus told them, get in the boat and start heading home. They are in his will, but they're not spared adversity. We sometimes think God's plan is that we, as John Allen was saying, be safe. Surely God wants that for us too. God wants us to have an easy, comfortable life. That's not the case. Jesus' teaching as he ends the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7 is that the one who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice will have everything go smooth for them. That's not the way the verse ends. It says, no. The promise is, when the rains come in torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against their house, it won't collapse because it is built on the solid rock of Jesus' words. We won't be spared adversity when we're in the will of the Lord. But because we are looking to him in faith, in trust, in obedience, our ultimate state is secure. Because we are in God's care. The parallel account of this story, it's fascinating. This is in Mark's gospel, tells us that while Jesus was still on the mountainside in prayer, it says he saw the disciples straining at the oars. This is Mark chapter 6, verse 48. They were in his care. Verse 25 of our text, Matthew 14. Shortly before dawn, so they'd been out there all night, Jesus went out to them walking on the sea. Now what about this miracle? Some people say this doesn't seem right, not because they're questioning the possibility of miracles, but they're saying, would Jesus do this? Jesus usually only acts miraculously to save or to help somebody else. Would he actually do a miracle, for his own convenience? I have two responses. First, maybe this is God doing a miracle for Jesus. I mean, God is quite willing to do that. The best known one is the resurrection, raised Jesus from the dead. In other words, maybe we can see this as a miracle done on the water by God for Jesus, rather than something Jesus did for his own convenience. And number two, I think God would delight to do this for Jesus, to show the world, this is my son. He can make a path through the muddy waters just as I can. Well, the disciples weren't ready to have that as an interpretation of what was going on yet. Verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. Isn't that a picture of us very often? We are in our boat, we're straining at the oars, we're not making much headway, it's in the middle of the night, we can't see very much, but Jesus can see us. And Jesus comes up to us, but at first we don't recognize him. And we think that it's another bad thing happening, and we cry out in fear. How does Jesus respond? Verse 27. Jesus immediately said to him, there's all these immediately, action, things happening. He said, "Take courage, It is I. Don't be afraid. And interestingly, the "it is I" is probably more than just Jesus saying, hey, it's me, because it is I. Yeah, it has that meaning, but it's actually the words in Greek, I am. Those are the two words, I am. And we can see shades of the many times in the Bible when God reveals himself as I am. God is so great, like he can't be defined by saying he's like this or he's like this. Ultimately, it's just I am. And what's more, there are many times in the Bible where God makes one of these I am statements where he adds, and fear not. This is Jesus helping the disciples and helping us realize this is God walking on the water. I said this story is like a tableau of the Christian life. Well, Dale Bruner says, so in the first act, the Lord approaches his troubled church astride the waves and speaks to her, revealing himself, courage, I am, don't be afraid. Bruner goes on, in the second act, a believing disciple and an empowering Lord do the apparently impossible. They master the elements and for a brief moment give a glimpse of the church's supernatural possibilities in the world. Verse 28, Peter says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Note two things here. Peter doesn't ask Jesus for a promise. He doesn't say, Lord, promise I won't sink and I'll come to you. He just asks for an instruction. Lord, tell me to come to you on the water. That's what Peter is looking for. Not a promise, just Jesus saying what he should do. And Jesus says, come, and Peter does it. Jerome, an early church father and scholar, exalted, you command and immediately waters are solids. That's one thing. Peter doesn't ask for a promise, just the instruction. The second thing, Peter doesn't say, bid me walk on water, but bid me come to you. Peter was not thinking of an accomplishment, walk on water, which could be motivated by pride. Peter was instead thinking of coming to Jesus, a motive of love, his devotion. Jesus was there. He wanted to be there. Bruner continues, this second act continues with a second scene. So the first scene is Peter going and walking on the water. In the second scene, the believer becomes an unbeliever and sinks back into natural life. and then cries out to the Lord and is saved. Verse 30, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. If you remember the parable of the sower with its four soils, well, Peter is in this, he's sort of like being the third and the fourth soils. He starts to bear this miraculous fruit, like the fourth soil, but then he's overwhelmed by the other realities, and he starts sinking in defeat like the choked soil, the choked plants of the third soil. And that's a picture of all of us believers. We all like Peter. We have a mix. Times we're full of faith, times unfaith, times that we can do feats, and sometimes when we are failures. And those times that we can do the impossible, that we can master the elements, they come exclusively because of the powerful command of Jesus and our obedience. That command came as Peter prayed, a bold prayer even. Those times then that we cannot, when we don't have that supernatural ability to rise above the elements, those times that we cannot come when we are focusing on life's realities rather than focusing on the Lord. Peter had faith and obeyed and experienced Christ's power. He also got distracted by what was around him, and he lost that power. But what does Jesus do when we find ourselves in this second scene, second act? What does he do when we are weak and when we start to fail? When we are believing, Jesus gives us a share in his power. When we are doubting and we are sinking, crying out for help, he stretches out his helping hand. Verse 31, immediately, again, that word, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? Notice, Jesus did scold Peter, you man of little faith, why did you doubt? But fortunately, Jesus saves before he scolds. Immediately as we cry out, he reaches out his strong hands to help. And then verse 32, when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. The storm ceased. Verse 33, then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. This is the final indication that this is, Matthew is saying, this is God who was walking on the water. Not only does Jesus rule over the surging sea and still its waves, not only do we have Jesus reminding us of God, saying, I am, but also we see the disciples' response. The disciples worshiped. And ancient Jews would not worship people. They worshiped God. It took the disciples a little while to get there. First, it's a ghost, but eventually, you are the Son of God. So, This is a tableau of the Christian life. Do you see yourself in that tableau in any way? If you do, also see Jesus watching you in the storm, in your boat tossed around and you're getting tired by manning the oars. Well, see Jesus coming to you in that situation and even bidding you to come to him on the waves. And when you sink, reaching out with his hand to save you, and then climbing into the boat and the storm calming.